This is Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Nuclear madness in the mind of Donald Trump. Can he achieve denuclearization of North Korea, or do we face extinction anxiety under a mentally unstable president? Tonight on Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell, John Gartner served as a part-time assistant professor of psychiatry at the Johns Hopkins University Medical School for 28 years. Areas of specializations including borderline personality disorder, bipolar disorder, and depression. He's the author of In Search of Bill Clinton, a psychological biography, for which he had him on our show, as well as the author of The Hypomanic Edge, the link between a little craziness and a lot of success in America. And Richard Painter, associate counsel to the president in the White House counsel's office under George W. Bush. He's the S. Walter Recchi Professor of Corporate Law at University of Minnesota Law School, and he's currently a candidate for the U.S. Senate in Minnesota, having converted to the Democratic Party. The newly edited book that's just out is edited by John Gartner, Stephen Busser, and Leonard Cruz, Rocket Man, Nuclear Madness and the Mind of Donald Trump. Welcome to both of you. This is scary stuff you've written about.
Yes, it is.
Including all those pictures and images of nuclear war. Let me start with John. We've gone from fire and fury, that may be an outgrowth of this malignant narcissism that you claim Trump has, which we'll talk about, to a summit meeting with the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. Is that a sign, John, that he's more rational than perhaps you'd thought?
Well, of course, look, we all want to be hopeful about the possibility of a peaceful resolution, or at least a lack of military escalation. So all of us are obviously pulling for the best possible result. But I think when you look at Trump's behavior, what you see is that he is erratic. Mm-hmm. That's, in fact, the first article in the book is The Erratic President. So he goes from off-the-hook escalation with this rocket man and we'll destroy North Korea to agreeing impulsively to a summit. Without any pre-negotiation. He did it on a whim when there were some South Korean diplomats who had suggested that the idea. And then he cancels the summit erratically, and then it's on again, and then he has no conditions and gets nothing in return and comes back and says the nuclear crisis is solved. And now later we find out actually they're escalating their nuclear program. So it's sort of like round and round he goes, and where he stops, nobody knows. And so just the sheer erraticness of it is dangerous, just to get started there.
Let me ask you, though, if I play devil's advocate, he's a bluffer when he negotiates. It's pretty transparent. Right now we're in the middle of a trade war.
That's no bluff.
Yeah, well, it's no bluff, but there's some people who think his end game is to actually get to where we have no tariffs. He's going to take it right to the line of world crisis and then say, come on, everybody get together. I don't know that he thinks like that. Obviously, there's not a lot of evidence. But how do you put into it the bluffing, negotiating style he's always had? I mean, he basically did that with North Korea. He took the threat right till the end, and then he's claiming that this guy, the fat boy in North Korea, is a great guy.
Look, I think one of the problems people have with Donald Trump is they try to impute rationality.
Yes.
In other words, you try to find some hidden thread of sense. I was just reading about his tariffs, and people are saying we don't know what his goals are, we don't know why he's doing it, but maybe he's got a hidden strategy. This idea that he has a hidden strategy is really very optimistic. It's kind of wishful thinking. The truth is he's a one-man wrecking ball. The nature of his psychology is to be malevolent and destructive. This gets back to this issue of his personality disorder. He meets criteria for a disorder called malignant narcissism that was first introduced by Erich Fromm, who was himself a refugee from Nazi Germany. And it has 4 components: narcissism, but also paranoia, sociopathy, and sadism. And so these are people who actually are malevolent. They actually revel in destruction and chaos and pain and destruction to other people. And so there's a part of him that actually gets off on it, to put it bluntly, to get off on the destructive energies that he can feel powerful because he's unleashing them on the world. So this is a deep pathology, and to make it worse, he's getting worse. That the nature of this personality disorder is that people deteriorate over time. And Erich Fromm said, remember we thought he was going to pivot and become presidential. That was our other wish-fulfilling fantasy. Mm-hmm. Well, what Erich Fromm said is that when these people get power, they become dramatically worse. Their narcissism, their paranoia becomes inflamed, and they're now basically unbridled in their destructive aggression because no one can control them. And that's exactly what's happened. And we do see this psychology in totalitarian leaders. We've seen it in people like Hitler, like Milosevic. It's a type. It's a pattern. It's not just a one-off. And he's fitting that playbook perfectly. I also think he's deteriorating because I think he's somewhat manic, and I also think he's deteriorating because we're seeing signs of cognitive decline. If you compare interviews he did in the 1980s to current interviews, we see a dramatic deterioration in his vocabulary and his reasoning, all of which are signs of organically based cognitive decline. So he's getting worse psychiatrically, he's getting worse neurologically, and the fantasy that there's some brilliant plan behind all this is just that, a fantasy.
Malignant narcissism, you've claimed and others that Hitler and Stalin, you mentioned Milosevic, are examples of this. Can Trump credibly be put in that kind of a category for people to actually buy that?
Absolutely. It doesn't mean he's as bad as Hitler.
Right.
But, someone with stage 1 cancer and someone with stage 4 cancer both have cancer. At this point, we are watching a cancer developing. How far will it go before it's aborted or stopped? Actually, we don't know the answer to that question. But I think when you look at his separation of children at the border and the fact that he had actually planned, until he was stopped, to separate hundreds of thousands of children, now we're starting to talk about something that's starting to look like concentration camps. In fact, the original definition of a concentration camp was not a death camp. It was a camp meant to concentrate a certain group of people who are considered undesirable outside of the general population, whether it's their religion, their national origin, or what have you. And here's someone who's actually setting up camps. And I remember when I was warning people that right after the election that this is someone who has the same character structure as Hitler or Stalin or these other dictators. Everyone said, oh, come on, you're just exaggerating. Well, now it looks more plausible. And how far would he go if he was not restrained? We don't even know the answer to that question. So the point is that not whether he's as bad as Hitler. The point is he's cut from the same cloth. He has the same diagnosis. He has the same psychology.
Let me ask, this particular book, with its focus on risk in nuclear war, why did you write it? And, that book that was already out there for which you contributed from the Duty to Ward movement, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, 27 psychologists and psychiatrists and mental health experts assess the president. What is this book meant to be in terms of timing and why?
Well, of course, the greatest nightmare would be a nuclear nightmare. That really is the kind of the worst doomsday scenario. And so that was the aspect of his mental disturbance that we were most concerned with. The other thing I forgot to mention about why he's getting worse is he used to be surrounded by these adults. Yeah. Everyone said, well, he'll have good advisors. At least they'll restrain his worst impulses. And what he has, and I always said, this is someone who is incapable of being restrained. What he will do is extrude and purge all those who try to restrain him. And that's exactly what is in the process of happening. Mm-hmm. And I think this is something that I really want to hear what Richard has to say, because one example of that is his bringing on someone like John Bolton. And Richard and his work in the Bush administration worked with John Bolton, and I think he's got a few choice things to say. I think he's called him the most dangerous person that ever worked in the Bush administration, if I'm quoting that correctly.
Yeah, in fact, we're going to get to that. Let me ask you one more question before we do. I have to ask it for, as always, the comment that this violates the Goldwater rule, that you've never analyzed Trump, face to face as a doctor would. Your comment on that?
Look, I've written a lot about this, talked a lot about it, but to boil it down to a simple case of, in ethics, we always have a hierarchy. Sometimes we have to choose between one consideration or another. But imagine this scenario. Imagine a gunman enters the New York Public Library, waves his weapon, and says, everyone here is going to die today. And I'm sitting at a table there, and I scream, someone call the police. If the librarian came up to me and said, shh, this is a library, no talking. That's true. That's a rule. But under those circumstances, only a lunatic would follow it. We're in mortal danger. Millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of us are in mortal danger. I think now is not the time to be quiet because of the nicety of a obscure rule that's actually quite outdated, that is from 50 years ago, addressing a lawsuit that took place in the early 60s.
All right, let's move to Richard Painter. And I want to start on the ethics side, because he was ethics counsel under George W. Bush. Trump has never revealed his taxes. He's retained essentially his business ownership. And I want to hear why exactly, Richard, is this so bad, and the impact, what he's done to the sort of the concept of ethics in national government.
Well, every other president since Nixon has disclosed his tax returns, so people know where his money's coming from. And in Donald Trump's case, a lot of the taxable income comes through these companies that he owns. So they might have separate tax returns, but they would be disclosed as part of his. And we do not know where he's getting his money. We know that he went in default on a lot of loans in New York in the 1990s, and that most people in the United States won't loan him money anymore. And it's been a mystery as to where he's borrowing his money. Since the mid to late 1990s, that's been a mystery over 20 years. We have our suspicions. He seems like Russia and some other countries, but we don't know. And that's a very dangerous situation. We don't know if our president is beholden to foreign powers. And Congress is not willing to hold him accountable. Part of the problem is that members of Congress, some of them have their own conflicts of interest. Senators who own medical device stocks, Congress people who own, members of the House who own pharmaceutical stocks, and the list goes on and on. So it's not a problem unique to Donald Trump, but it's really very dangerous for our democracy. You don't know. You don't have the basic information about who your leaders are beholden to financially.
The gutting of the sort of the role of the ethics controls in Washington and the White House is that a really bad sign of things to come, or just the overall corruption and conflict of interest that we're living through?
Well, we certainly have had a problem with corruption, conflicts of interest, a lot of it through campaign cash, PACs, super PACs, and the rest of that. But what's different here is you have lawyers in the White House who basically say, for example, the ethics lawyer said that the ethics rules don't apply to the White House staff. Kellyanne Conway was caught in two very, very clear violations of the Hatch Act, where she used her public position, her official position, to advocate for the election of a Senate candidate in Alabama, Roy Moore. And the Office of Special Counsel found that was a violation, and yet the White House says it wasn't, and basically flat-out lies. This is the world of alternative facts we're living in, to use Kellyanne Conway's own language.
Why are you running for Senate, and why as a Democrat?
Well, I think, I've done a lot of writing of op-eds and TV interviews talking about corruption in Washington, but we've got to fix the problem. And I think that it's time for me to run for office, to make it clear that my priority is going to be getting money out of politics. I won't take any PAC money at all in this campaign. I believe strongly that we need to have a government that works for the people. So that's what I'm going to advocate for. Quite frankly, I look at both political parties, the amount of money in both political parties, and I'm frustrated with it. I'm frustrated with the corporate influence. Both political parties I'm very, very concerned about. But at this point, the Republican Party is so beholden to Donald Trump and to the far right wing, particularly the so-called religious conservatives, that any relationship with the Republican Party, for me, at this point, is unworkable.
Okay, now let's get back to what John was alluding to, that the adult supervision seems to have been taken out person by person at the White House. John Kelly expected at any moment. I want to get your comments on that, but specifically, you seem to have insights into John Bolton when he was there under W.
Yes, I never worked with him directly personally, but I talked to people who had. And he was the ambassador of the United Nations, which is really quite ironic, but he didn't believe in the United Nations. He is a strong proponent of unilateral force and using force to accomplish U.S. objectives around the world. He despises people who are different than himself. He despises Muslims. He despises people who believe in the United Nations and in globalism and trying to have countries work together. He's extremely authoritarian. And if anybody is going to be the person likely to get us into a war, it would be John Bolton. So I particularly the combination of him and Donald Trump is a very, very explosive one.
Do you feel that now he's supposed to be in a role that is a coordinating role, and do you feel that he actually has lied and exaggerated, say, about the WMD in Iraq and things like that?
Well, he certainly was on the side of those who were pushing the weapons of mass destruction theory before the Iraq invasion. And I would hope we'd learn from that how critically important it is to get the facts right before decisions are made. And I don't think he's somebody who wants to do that. I think he's somebody who wants to shoot first and ask questions later. And when you're playing around with high-powered weaponry and also nuclear weapons, that's a very dangerous approach.
What are your thoughts on Mike Pompeo coming in as Secretary of State?
Well, I think he also has an authoritarian instinct. From time to time, he also has disparaged Muslims and others. I don't think that he is an appropriate person to be trying to extend a diplomatic hand to the rest of the world. Remember, the role of the State Department, just try to work things out with other countries around the world so that we don't end up in a confrontation, so that the United States does not have to go to war. And unfortunately, under the Trump administration, this extends back to Rex Tillerson's time at the State Department. The career State Department employees, many of them left, and they've undermined the role of diplomacy. And I just don't think that Mr. Pompeo, as Secretary of State, is going to move us in the direction we need to go, which is to focus on diplomacy.
Richard, is Trump unfit to be the commander-in-chief?
Yes. You just look at his Twitter feed, and it's quite obvious that he is extremely aggressive. He becomes obsessed with various journalists, with Hillary Clinton, his political opponents, real and perceived. He uses infantile language at times. And the idea of him being in control of nuclear weapons is downright frightening.
The Mueller investigation, we're down to our last couple of minutes. The Mueller investigation, your thoughts on that impact, and is it really going to maybe fire his impulsivity off even worse?
Well, that may. I mean, Bob Mueller is focusing on criminal conduct in connection with the Russian interference with our election. Now, we need to keep in mind that there's a lot more going on that we ought to be very, very concerned about than just what Robert Mueller is investigating. There's criminal conduct outside the scope of the Russian interference in the election that Robert Mueller is not going to address. And there's also non-criminal but extremely dangerous conduct in this administration, including violations of the United States Constitution that are pervasive. That need to be addressed. And that's why the House and the Senate Judiciary Committee need to convene and have hearings as we did in 1973. And that's one of the points I'm making in my Senate campaign, that we need to take this situation very seriously and not just rely on Bob Mueller. But meanwhile, yes, Donald Trump is very paranoid about Mueller, particularly when Mueller gets anywhere near the Trump finances.
Yes.
He starts making noises if he's going to fire Bob Mueller. And it's a very, very precarious situation right now.
You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll talk next about is Trump on a path to war with Richard Painter and John Gartner, so stay with us. From Philly to Fresno, Brooklyn to Boston, Data Cable Superstars has the best prices on installation of Cat 5 and Cat 6 wiring for cameras, computers, phone, and data, specializing in off-peak installs as to not interrupt your workflow. If this is an I need it done yesterday situation, then it's time to call Data Cable Superstars at 203-942-1427 or go to datacablesuperstars.com. That's Data Cable Superstars, all one word, .com. Data Cable Superstars, where estimates and big ideas are always free. And we're back with mental health expert John Gartner and former White House Ethics Counsel, current candidate for the U.S. Senate, Minnesota, Richard Painter. Richard, you mentioned that there's other criminal areas that should be investigated outside of the Mueller investigation. From a criminal sense, what are you talking about?
Well, we've had violations of the Financial Conflict of Interest Statute, 18 United States Code 208, by various members of this administration. There certainly is very strong evidence of financial conflicts of interest. People who follow Donald Trump's lead of holding on to investments that conflict with their official duties and then participate in government matters that have an effect on those investments. And the difference between Donald Trump and those others is that the criminal conflict of interest statute does not apply to the president and vice president, but it does apply to everybody else in the administration. And there have been repeated instances of conflicts, whether it involves the Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, or Carl Icahn, who was doing work for President Trump, pretending not to be government employee at the beginning of the beginning of the administration, actually for the first several months. And we do not know whether crimes have been committed, so I don't think I should allege that at this point, but there certainly is very strong evidence of financial conflicts of interest that need to be investigated by the Department of Justice Public Integrity Division throughout this administration, and I've only mentioned a very few of those instances where there appear to be serious conflicts, that at least the evidence at this point justifies an investigation, and then the Justice Department can determine whether a crime has been committed.
All right, let me ask you another question, because it's not really part of germane to the Mueller investigation about Russian collusion, but it certainly is not good stuff, which is there's been a lot of sense that there's been money laundering from Russian oligarchs. 86 condos have been bought for cash in the Trump Tower, plus one of the casinos did plead guilty to money laundering. That's a business. It's an outgrowth of his business. Is that fair at this point to be investigated?
Yes, that does need to be investigated. All of that needs to be investigated. The financial conflicts of interest are very serious. These condos, when foreign governments are buying these condos, that'll be a violation of the Monuments Clause of the Constitution, which prohibits anyone holding a position of public trust from receiving profits and benefits from dealings with foreign governments.
All right, John, let me ask you now. You're alleging that the risk of nuclear war is increasing as Trump goes downhill. You talked a little bit about that. We're going to go into a little bit more detail. Are you worried, first off, that the book came out right when it appears the opposite was happening, which was he was going to see if he can denuclearize North Korea, that the credibility of the book might be shot, and also that it's such a scary thought? Is it hard for people to get their arms around that you could be serious about something like this, that the nuclear risk is rising?
I think it's almost too terrifying to consider.
Yeah.
There were some authors that were concerned that we might look like we had egg on our face coming out with the kind of Chicken Little, the sky is falling when just as he's winning the Nobel Peace Prize. And I always said, I've been a fool for much less, so I'd rather wear egg on my face than be breathing nuclear fallout. Unfortunately, I don't think that this sort of Nobel Peace Prize scenario is really likely. Because as I said, after that point, he canceled the summit, then he uncanceled it, then he shook his hand and came back with really no concessions at all, saying he'd solved the problem. He's so erratic that in the introduction to the book, I described the time frame where, at this point in the publication, this is what he was doing. Then at this point, it was off. Then at this point, it was on. And so it made our job difficult in terms of the timing of the book, because books obviously can't turn around in a news cycle. But I think if you look at the big picture, the point is that we, as Richard said, we are at extreme risk when you look at someone who is dangerously mentally ill and unstable and deteriorating, who is threatening to use weapons and has access to them. I mean, under those conditions, we would commit someone. Seriously, I'm not being hyperbolic. If someone had a deteriorating mental health picture and they had access to weapons and they were threatening to use them, we would at least bring them in for an evaluation. But he is above that law, and so we do see signs that he's deteriorating. One thing about malignant narcissism is they actually tend towards psychosis, so that the paranoid and grandiose ideas start to become delusions. And so we actually run the risk that he might launch a nuclear strike based in the throes of a paranoid delusion, or that he might be cognitively confused and not even quite understand what's happening. And you mentioned the stress of the Mueller investigation. I look at it from a more psychological point of view, which is that the stress of the Mueller investigation makes him feel frightened and cornered and disempowered. Mm-hmm. And so given his psychology, the logical thing for him to do is to strike back. That's always his instinct. And so to use his power in some mighty, frightening, awe-inspiring way would give him a sense of omnipotent destructiveness.
All right, John, let me ask you on that point, because that's a wag the dog scenario. And
exactly.
Clinton was accused of that during reckless behavior with Monica Lewinsky. You're an expert on Clinton. What's the difference?
Well, first of all, I think that contention was actually false. He was trying to get Osama bin Laden, which in retrospect would have been a very good thing, wouldn't it? So he had intelligence that Osama bin Laden was at this factory. They launched a missile. He'd left. They missed him. But it was obviously the right mission. And had he succeeded, we would have avoided 9/11. So I don't think that was a wag the dog scenario. I think that was an alleged wag the dog scenario.
Okay.
But here, I think we really have someone who, George Bush once said nobody wants to be a wartime president. I don't think that's true about him. I think this is someone who loves the smell of napalm in the morning. This is someone who really revels in destructive power. Whether it's punch that guy in the face and get him out of here, he enjoys that type of thing. So there's a perverse part of him that if he is cornered, would actually feel triumphant to do something powerfully destructive, to turn the tables, from being the victim to the victor.
On the cognitive decline question, of course, he's going to say, "Wait a minute, I passed that test from his White House physician." And as you answer that, what does extreme president hedonist mean? Present.
We were actually part of a group that sent a letter to Dr. Ronnie Jackson asking him to give him a cognitive screening test, which he did. But it's important to understand that passing the Montreal Cognitive Assessment means that he can identify a camel, he can repeat 3 numbers backwards. In other words, he's not grossly demented. It doesn't mean that he isn't in the process of organic cognitive decline. People who are intelligent and educated can lose a lot of IQ points before they can't identify a camel. So if you take all of the data, the fact that we see such gross deterioration in his verbal productions since the 80s, when he was articulate, he spoke in polished paragraphs, he made sense. Now he can't even finish a sentence without derailing into some irrelevancy. Sometimes we don't even understand what he's saying. It sounds like word salad. So he's not at the bottom of the hill, but he's rolling downhill. And the further downhill he goes, the more incapable he's going to be of handling the complexities necessary in a nuclear emergency. One of the skills most necessary, if you look at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and one of our authors writes about that, is you have to be able to put yourself in your adversary's perspective. To be able to, that's what Kennedy did. He figured a way out of the Cuban Missile Crisis by figuring out a way to solve it and allowing Khrushchev to save face. Mm-hmm. That's not the kind of empathic, strategic calculation that Trump is going to be cognitively or psychologically capable of making.
What's extreme present hedonist?
Yes, so extreme present hedonism is a really interesting concept, and we have Philip Zimbardo, a famous psychologist, writing about that. It's people who only care about pleasure in the present. They don't think about the long-term consequences of their actions. And so they do, whatever Joe Scarborough calls him, a day trader. He does what's going to help him win that news cycle. He doesn't have a long-term strategic sense of what the long-term consequences of this will be. He wants to look strong on TV today. He doesn't really care about whether it helps or hurts the U.S. security or economy in the long run.
All right, Richard, let's talk about this. You seem to think that nuclear war might even be probable. We could have 1 to 2 billion people die of mass starvation from not even a major nuclear attack.
Well, the results of nuclear war, as we all know, would be catastrophic. And this is something we've had to worry about ever since the deployment of the first atom bomb. And, I have to say there's a reason why there was controversy in the 1960s that gave rise to the Goldwater rule. But in 1964, there were those who were concerned enough about Barry Goldwater's rhetoric surrounding, communism and the Russian threat, which obviously the Russian threat is very serious as it is today. But Goldwater's rhetoric was such that some psychologists and psychiatrists felt that he was over the line, should not be trusted with nuclear weapons. And I don't want to revisit the 1964 election, but I think it's extremely dangerous to have a rule that would limit psychiatrists and psychologists from weighing in on the mental stability of elected leaders who are in control of a nuclear arsenal. And I also think these comparisons to Clinton or to other presidents are not appropriate at all. Certainly, Clinton had an issue with sex, as have many elected officials. But those who thought that justified removal from office, whether it be Judge Brett Kavanaugh when he was working for Ken Starr, or on the left, you've got people like Senator Kristen Gillibrand of New York. I mean, that shows no sense of proportion. Clinton had a psychological problem with sex, yes, but it was not a threat to our national security. He was able to function as a president, at least in a safe manner. Certainly the sex scandal and the way the Republicans made a lot of hay out of it distracted him from accomplishing his agenda. But it was not an unsafe presidency. The Kennedy presidency faced an enormous crisis. You mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Kennedy also had an issue with women and sex and so forth. But he was able to keep his cool in a crisis and guide us through it. And that's a crisis that could have ended up in nuclear war. You could imagine where we would have been with Donald Trump in the White House during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Let me ask you this, Richard, because you've been in the White House. The president literally can decide unilaterally to have nuclear weapons used, regardless of the military, the other folks in the White House or Congress.
Yeah, well, I've not worked in the chain of command there with respect to the nuclear weapons. I was the ethics lawyer dealing with financial conflicts of interest. But as I understand it, if the president gives an order, the military follows the order. I would say if generals are convinced that the president is insane, they might disobey the order. They might not.
All right, John, let me ask you, Kim Jong-un, Putin, Trump, they're kind of the triumvirate of leaders right now. Psychologically, are you worried any of these three guys could do us in?
Well, I was just thinking when you said that, we've got a new axis of evil and we're on it. Yes, of course, because the thing about this narcissist is malignant narcissists almost always get their countries into war because they're paranoid. They constantly feel like they need to attack the enemy before the enemy attacks them. And because they're grandiose, they want to expand their power. And because they're sadists, they actually enjoy trampling the weaker people or the weaker countries under their feet and being victorious over them. So everything about their psychology pushes them towards war. So I think that Donald Trump would like to be a wartime president. And the fact that we live in a nuclear age and that he does have, as you were discussing, unilateral control of the nuclear arsenal means that really every living human being is currently at risk because Donald Trump is president. And that's very important. I've spoken about this now in many interviews, and I've always been shocked that even the people interviewing me don't know that this is the law, that Donald Trump can authorize a nuclear strike of any or all of our missiles, and within 10 minutes of his authorizing it, they must be in the air. There's no second key. There's no process. It's the system was built for speed during the Cold War, when the fear was that the Russians could destroy us in 10 minutes. And so the idea being that if we only had a 10-minute window from the time the Russian launched to the time we had to retaliate, then we had to streamline it for speed. So it's actually built for speed, not for deliberation.
All right, do you think Kim Jong and Putin are crazy?
Well, it's very interesting about Kim Jong-un. There have been, in the book, we actually have several authors just talking about his psychology. And, of course, we know a lot less about him than we do about Trump. So there's a lot of mystery and speculation. Some have argued that he is a malignant narcissist. My colleague Gerald Post, who's actually wrote a brief on that for the CIA when he was working for them, doing psychological profiling. However, interestingly, other authors in the book describe him as actually a very rational actor, that what he's doing actually makes sense. And, in a way, he's kind of winning, right? He's getting all this power through his nuclear brinksmanship. And then a third author talks about this kind of fitting into the psychology of North Korea, that they have a perpetual feeling of being a victim, which is sort of the malignant narcissist position, just like Trump always feels like he's a victim. So their whole psychology is this idea that they're embattled by evil forces, and they must be strong with nuclear weapons to defend themselves.
Richard, can you answer briefly who this Reverend Ralph Drollinger is that you mentioned in your book, in your section?
Well, he's a so-called preacher who has really distorted the Christian faith. I'm an active churchgoer, and I see a number of these people, and he's one of them, who take the Bible and superimpose on the Bible their own psychological obsessions. Here with authoritarianism, there's a lot of emphasis on male domination over women and use of violence to accomplish one's objectives, and characterizing God as a violent God. And the emphasis here is that this president somehow has a mission, God's mission to accomplish here on earth by using violence, whether it's at the southern border or in his military policy or anywhere else. It is extremely dangerous. And Drollinger's not the only one. He's the one that's closest to the White House right now, but this whole so-called evangelical council is also made up of some very strange preachers, none of them really from the mainline denominations that used to dominate American Christianity. So this is really a threat, particularly in a country where the founders made it very clear that we're not to have establishment of religion. And this is a dangerous use of religion and also a threat to our Constitution.
And we'll say that he preaches, I guess, to apparently cabinet members in the White House every week. You're listening to Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll talk about how to reduce the risk of nuclear war in our final segment. Our final segment with John Gartner and Richard Painter, that new book they had got out there on the threat of nuclear war being increased essentially by President Trump being in office. John, I guess we'll start with you. What are some of the things you think that we need to do to move from what you say a more deliberative approach to launching versus a speed-based solely approach?
Well, the bottom line is we need to elect more people like Richard Painter. And I'll say why I'm saying that. There was recently a bill in Congress, House Resolution 69, Senate Bill 200, that was actually a bipartisan bill introduced in part by Bob Corker, saying that congressional approval should be required for an unprovoked nuclear first strike. So we're not talking about missiles, in the air heading towards the United States. In that case, that would be a retaliatory strike. But a first strike should require the authorization of Congress. And they put that rule in, frankly, because it should be there anyway. One human being should not have the power to destroy the human species. Even Barack Obama could have a stroke or God knows what. But they put it in there specifically because they were worried about Donald Trump's erratic use of the nuclear button. But of course, as happens with the Republicans, they always melt like snow under the heat of Donald Trump's ire. And so they dropped that bill. They had one day of hearings on it, and then they dropped it. We need people who are going to stand up to this president, hold him accountable, be a check and a balance. And the Republican Party has shown that they are unworthy to be statesmen because they are unwilling to exercise that constitutional duty. That's really why we need people like Richard Painter in Congress. We need Democrats who are going to hold him accountable. But I have to say I'm a particular fan of Richard because he tells it like it is. He's very straightforward. He's an aggressive straight shooter. I sometimes say that we have two parties in this country, one that has no balls and one that has no shame. The Democrats suffer from low testosterone, in my view. So to get someone with high testosterone, we have to steal someone from the other team. So welcome, Richard. We need you.
Okay. Richard, let me ask you this idea of having a law that that the U.S. would not engage in any first strike nuclear action. Is that, though, to a crazy guy on the other side, sort of giving away the store, giving away our power to bluff, the fire and fury, if you will?
Well, no. I think we have plenty of conventional firepower that can be used not only to defend our country, but if a president chooses to defend another country, to do so. I hope we will think very seriously about how we get involved, how much we get involved in disputes overseas militarily. But a no nuclear first strike rule, I think, is a very good one. I cannot imagine a situation where a nuclear first strike would be justified. And the results of the nuclear first strike are catastrophic.
Do you think it's possible, or how important it needs to be that the balance of power be restored from the congressional role versus the executive?
Even though Congress is very dysfunctional, has trouble getting things done, you've got conflicts of interest with members of Congress of both political parties. I certainly have my gripes about Congress, but there's an enormous risk when you concentrate power in the hands of the president. And the president, through executive orders and various other measures, can do so much to change our country very quickly. And once again, this is a president he's very quite difficult to remove. You need 2/3 of the senators to convict a president. Mm-hmm. And the only time in this century we actually impeached a president was Clinton. I mean, they got Nixon to resign rather than be impeached. Mm-hmm. But Clinton was the only one who was impeached, and he was impeached over something that really was not impeachment worthy. It was just a silly sexual matter affair. So, what you've got is the use of the impeachment process only for political purposes. Republicans who defend Trump for political purposes, who won't even convene hearings of the House and Senate Judiciary Committee, as they did in 1973 with respect to Nixon. So the bottom line is the president has an enormous amount of power. It's extremely difficult to get rid of a president who has been misbehaving, at least in this politically polarized environment we have today. And so, therefore, we do need to think very seriously about cutting back on presidential power. And that includes presidential power when there's a president in there whom people agree with. And one of the problems I think Democrats are running into is that they protected President Obama when he expanded his executive power through various executive orders. Mm-hmm. And that, while Donald Trump, of course, is far more authoritarian than anything President Obama ever did, the Democratic members of the House and Senate are a bit of a jam there, trying to stand up to President Trump and his abuse of executive power. So bottom line was we need to pull back on the power of the presidency across the board, regardless of who's in office.
All right. John, now you talked about evidence of what you see as cognitive decline. The president, mm-hmm. on the other hand, has sole control over issuing any nuclear attacks. Nobody thinks the 25th Amendment will be used. What's the answer on fitness?
The answer as to whether he's fit, or the answer as to what the solution is.
To what the solution would be under what you're saying: cognitive decline, nuclear risk up.
Right. Run, don't walk to the polls. Bring your mother, your cousin, your babysitter, your grandmother. We are in an existential crisis. Make no mistake about it. The these next couple of elections will determine whether the United States of America survives as a democracy. And so it's that grave. We're at the brink of a constitutional crisis, and unless we put people like Richard Painter in Congress, we're really on the endangered species list.
Wow. Richard, by the way, and maybe John is more neutral. Where are you situated in the race there? Do you have a real shot at winning?
Oh yes, I think so. I am running on a platform that emphasizes the importance of holding President Trump accountable, and that means having hearings with the House and Senate Judiciary Committee, as we did in 1973, 74. And then fixing some of the fundamental economic problems that are frustrating Americans, including the need for a single-payer health insurance system, and then the importance of protecting our environment and dealing with the climate change, with the carbon tax, and some other measures. And these are things that a lot of Minnesotans are very concerned about. It's not a liberal versus conservative thing. It's about common sense. What are the practical policies we need to advance our economy, to protect the environment, and also to protect our democracy? And by the way, I won't take any PAC money because that's certainly corrupting both of our political parties.
Are you the Democratic nominee? Do you have a primary race fight?
I am in a primary against Senator Tina Smith, who holds the seat. She was appointed by Governor Dayton to replace Al Franken. And this is a race for the 2 years remaining in the Al Franken term.
Okay. Well, this has been a very fascinating, scary interview. And John, as usual, you're showing guts to come out with a book on nuclear madness right after we have a meeting on denuclearization. Thanks to John Gartner and Richard Painter, running for Senate in Minnesota. Rocket Man, Nuclear Madness, and the Mind of Donald Trump, edited by John Gartner, Stephen Busser, and Leonard Cruz. This has been Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. Our podcasts are available on YouTube. Search Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell. We'll see everybody next Monday night for another edition of Forensic Talk with Jim Campbell.
Thank you.
Attention small business owners. Growing your business can be tough. Just when you thought you were making money, you found out that you owe the government money. And now that you owe the IRS their cut of your business profits, you may be broke. And if you don't take things seriously, you could go to jail or have your business shut down. But you do have an option. If the IRS is threatening you for unpaid taxes, call the Tax Resources Network. Their tax professionals and ex-IRS agents have over 23 years of experience dealing with the IRS, saving business owners and the self-employed millions in tax dollars. Let us negotiate with the IRS on your behalf. We may be able to reduce your tax debt for a lot less than you owe, help with the IRS audit, and even criminal investigations. If your business owes the IRS $15,000 or more and the IRS is threatening you, don't wait and let your business get shut down or worse. Call for a free consultation. Call 800-910-4980. 800-910-4980. That's 800-910-4980. Again, 800-910-4980.